Some players spend hours studying builds, others just show up. Guess who actually wins? And I know that sounds wrong because if you played Call of Dragons for a while, you're probably thinking, of course skills matter. And yes, skills matter. Knowing heroes matter, knowing pets matter, knowing artifacts matter, knowing positioning matter. I'm not saying those things are useless. But lately, I have been wondering if we're giving skills way too much credits because I keep seeing another something strange. The players everybody talk about are usually the smartest players, the players who know every hero, every artifact, every counter, every build, every talent tree. But then I look at who actually gets rewards, who actually get influence, who actually win objectives. Sometimes it isn't the smartest player at all. Sometimes it's just the player who show up. And that made me ask a very uncomfortable question. What if what if reliability is stronger than skills? I start thinking about this after watching Alliance struggle with wars, with behemoths. I mean, all these things where the people who don't show up creates. And that's funny. And what's funny is that when a behemoth fail, people immediately start looking for complicated explanation. Maybe our build weren't wrong. Maybe our damage wasn't high enough. Maybe we're not having tier 5s. Maybe my hero is not awakened. Maybe we need stronger heroes. Maybe we need to more spenders. But then you look closer. Half the lands didn't even attend. And suddenly none of those other explanations matter. Because the first problem wasn't damage, the first problem was attendance. And that's where I think people are making a mistake. We love optimizing things that happen after players arrive. But what if the real problem is players never arrive at the first place? Then things get even more interesting because once I start paying attention, I notice this pattern everywhere. Just the behemoths, not just the behemoths, events, wars, territory pushes. It's basically everywhere. Every kingdom, even kingdom reputation. The lances that win isn't always the lances with the best players. It's often the lances with the most predictable players. And that's a huge difference. A predictable player is someone leadership can count on or count out. This is also matter. We're not talking about only that the leadership is knowing this guy is going to show up. We're also talking about the leadership knowing that this guy will not show up. This is also, you just have better prediction what will happen if you, for example, take this fight or that fight. A predictable player is worth more than a brilliant player who only appear when they feel like. And honestly, I don't think enough people talk about that because skills look impressive, reliability looks boring, but boring wins a surprising amount of objectives, which made me wondering something. Why do players spend so much time improving skills and so little time improving attendance? And yeah, this is one of the main questions for attendance. It can be anything, but in general, I think the people are way too obsessed over the builds and this type of things when they just have to show up when the fight start. Think about how much effort players put into optimization. Hours watching guides, hours testing heroes, hours comparing pets, hours discussing artifacts. And again, none of this is actually bad. I do it too. But imagine two players. One player studies every build in the game, the other player show up every important event. Who creates more value for the alliance? And the answer get uncomfortable very fast. Because The second player might actually be more valuable, not because they're strong, not because, but because they're present. That was a weird realization for me because most strategy game teach us to value knowledge. Cow dragons reward knowledge, but it also rewards availability, and availability is something players almost never think about. Then I noticed something that completely changed how I look at alliance leadership. Most leaders don't actually complain about weak players, they complain about unreliable players. Think about that. You rarely hear he's not strong enough. You constantly hear he never show up, he missed another timer, he wasn't there again, he say he won't come. That's a very different complaint because leadership can work around weakness, but leadership cannot work around uncertainty, and uncertainty is expensive. If leadership doesn't know who will show up, every plan become harder, every rally become harder, every objective become harder, every war become harder, and that's when I start wondering if attendance is actually a hidden resource. We always talk about resources. We talk about the gems, we talk about the speed ups, we talk about the combat points, tokens, universal medals. But what if attendance is one of the most valuable resources in the game? The weird part is that alliances with high attendance suddenly look stronger everywhere. Not because every individual player is stronger, but because the alliance become more efficient. Objectives get completed. Rallies get filled faster. Territory grow faster. Information spreads. Everything starts moving. And from outside, people say, "Whoa, this alliance is powerful." Maybe, or maybe they just have people who constantly show up. That's a completely different explanation. Then this lead me to another question. Why do so many alliances have great attendance when others struggle? And honestly, I don't think it's because they have better players. I think they build habits. That's the part I missed for a long time. The strong alliance aren't training attendance during important event. They're training attendance all season. Every timer, every objective, every reminder, every expectation. They are teaching players this is what we do. This is when we show up. This is normal. And eventually it become culture. Now the Alliance isn't relying on motivation anymore. They're relying on habits. And habits are much more reliable than motivation. Because let's be honest, I mean, today you may have some motivation to do something, tomorrow you may not have this motivation, or those things. You just cannot count on the motivation. You have to count on the discipline, and the discipline is forged with habits. This also explains something that always confused me. Why do some alliances look average for weeks and suddenly become monsters? I used to think it was spending, or migration, or wealth recruitment. Something it is. But sometimes they simply build better habits. And once enough players consistently show up, everything compounds. The alliance start winning more objectives. Winning more objectives create more confidence. Confidence improve attendance. Better attendance win more objectives. Now you have momentum. And momentum is terrifying because once the alliance get momentum, they start looking stronger than they actually are. Which creates another interesting question. What do players misunderstand about strong alliances? I think many players assume strong alliances are filled with extraordinary players. Sometimes they are. But I've been seeing alliances full of very normal players outperform stronger accounts. Why? Because they were all there at the same time, doing the same thing toward the same object. And honestly, that's harder to build than hero power. Hero power can be bought. Attendance culture can't. You actually have to earn it. And that might be one of the biggest competitive advantages in the entire game. Then I start looking at my own behavior. And honestly, I wasn't immune to this either. I've been spent plenty of time thinking about the builds, thinking about the heroes, thinking about the reports, thinking about optimization. But there were times where I probably generated some value simply by showing up. That's weird to admit. Because players likes feeling smart. Players like complicated answers. Players like hidden mechanics. Players like discovering secrets advantage. And to be fair, I I get so much knowledge. Um, for example, this season, when I was fighting, specifically for the artifact execution, which I'm going to make video, how you can easily get tons of merits with artifacts, about positioning, how you can get tons of merits by positioning. All this just by showing up. Sometimes watching other players how they do it, sometimes just by curiosity you do something and it end up to be very productive and you start implementing it in your strategy. But sometimes the answer is painfully simple. The player who walk in when it matter often beats the player who know everything but isn't there. And I think that's why this topic creates so much debate, because it challenges ego. Nobody wants to hear that consistency can outperform intelligence. Nobody wants to hear that reliability can outperform optimization. Nobody wants to hear that attendance can outperform theory crafting. But I think there is some truth there. Not because skill doesn't matter, because skills without presence create nothing. And then I think we arrive at the real lesson. Most players think the meta is heroes or artifacts or pets, formation, maybe spending, but maybe the real meta is much simpler. Maybe the real meta is becoming the player your alliance can count on. Because then your objectives start. Then timers hits, when timer hits, when war begin, when dragons spawn, when behemoth appear, nobody cares how many guides you watch it if you're offline. And that's the weird think about the Cow Dragons. The game reward brilliance, but it rewards reliability first. And honestly, the more I watch successful alliances, the more I think that might be one of the most underrated advantages in the entire game. So I'm curious now, have you ever seen an alliance with the strong players lose simply because they cannot get people online? Or have you been in alliance that keep winning because everybody always show up? Because the more I think about it, the more I believe attendance might be one of the strongest stats in Call of Dragons. And it's one nobody puts in their profile.